Hey everybody, welcome back. With this video, we're going to try to conclude our discussion reading of Nietzsche's On the Advantage and Disadvantage of History for Life. I'm going to read from the remaining sections, spending a little bit more time with some than others, but I'll try to read a passage or two from all of them and see if we can kind of, bring this together. So I'm starting in section 5, reading the opening paragraph of it. Nietzsche writes, "The surfeit of history of an age seems to me hostile and dangerous to life in 5 respects." So just real quickly, when there's this sort of excess of history, this excess of the historical thinking or the weight of history or history done in a particular way, perhaps this overly scientific, which I've tried to be somewhat clear about this, and in the past, that Nietzsche's a scientist, and perhaps the true sense, or the sense that I think that he wants to valorize. But there's a sense of the scientific in which it's no longer serving life. That there's a dedication, like there's sort of a dedication and a sense of assumption about what it is that science accomplishes. And this is something like the removal of bias, objectivity, facts or truths that come unadorned, culturally unadorned. They come without motivations and biographies behind them, without the impress of culture upon them. And so, like, if you just, if history is just sort of received as a unbiased, objective account of what's happened in the past, and it just keeps, as the years pass, you just keep getting more and more of this, that leads to this sort of this excessive, this surfeit of history that has the potential to be incredibly devastating to life, to history for life, for people's creative, engaged, powerful, modes of living, of creating meaning for themselves, stuff like that. Okay, so he says, 5 respects through such an excess, the contrast. So number 1, through such an excess, the contrast of inside and outside, which I think we talked about last time, discussed above, and is generated and the personality weakened. Thereby, point number 2, through this excess, an age comes to imagine that it possesses the rarest virtue, justice, to a higher degree than any other. In 3, any other age, through this excess, the instincts of a people are impaired, and the maturing of the individual no less than the whole is prevented. 4, through this excess, the belief harmful at any time in the old age of mankind is implanted, the belief of being a latecomer, an epigon. Through this excess, an age acquires the dangerous disposition of, and this is sort of the 5th point, the disposition of irony with regard to itself. And from this, the still more dangerous one of cynicism. So, and he's going to go on to talk about these things, but just sort of presenting them in short. So you've, on one hand, one of the effects of excessive history, the excessive amounts of history and excessive weight or impress of history upon the individual or culture as well, is going to be a heightening, a furthering of an inside-outside distinction, like what's in here and what's out there. And this is going to have, Nietzsche believes, excessive interiority, excessive inwardness for Nietzsche, weakens the personality. And that is that people aren't able to sort of be genuinely just becoming. They're not genuinely just active. It breeds a passivity and a level of reflection that, perhaps in other contexts, we could champion these things. But for Nietzsche, it's a sort of thinking that is impeding one's ability to act upon their motivations and desires in a healthy way, and we get too much in our head. He says here, he talks about justice, that if you're at a certain place in history, that you believe the justice that you're experiencing is better than any of this sort of previous civilizations, cultures, understanding or practice of justice. And as many criticisms as we might have, we might say that the day and age we live in is more dedicated to unbiased institution, even if they're failing, right? That the idea behind what's going on today is to aim for this sort of level of fairness, to attempt to really manifest our various ideals about justice within society. And Nietzsche is pointing out that there's a good chance that the ancient Greeks in particular had a better understanding of what justice really was, and were able to, instantiate it, to act upon it, to live it, than people today. He says the instincts are imperative, which we talked about. He says the accessibility of harmful any time the old age of mankind is implanted, that we're like the idea that we live sort of at the end of history. We've got all those people that lived a long time ago. The farther back you go, the more sort of naive they are, the less sort of they're able to truly understand the world. They have inferior methods, inferior understandings, inferior theories, et cetera, et cetera. That just the idea of being a latecomer to history is problematic. In some ways, we're the young ones. Like we're the most recent, in a sense that without a sort of healthy view of history, healthy understanding of history, we're the ones that have much more to sort of overcome as a result. That due to our sort of inheritance, there's a lot of deconstructing that has to happen. There's a lot of parsing through. There's a lot of forgetting, right? As Nietzsche talks about, if we're going to have sort of a fighting chance at being healthy individuals in a healthy society. And this, of course, all of this excessive history, excessive knowledge, understanding what knowledge is, and all that stuff leads to irony, leads to cynicism. And I think that there are healthy attitudes towards irony and cynicism, but I think that what Nietzsche is trying to get at is this becomes a sort of default mode in place of a healthy, assertive, active attempt to create values, to create meaning, to live the sort of life that he is, espousing, is something that our irony makes it impossible. Our cynicism makes it impossible. Oh, well, things have always been this way, or all it can be is like a joke. It can't be anything that we take seriously. Okay, so saying all that, let's go to just to flesh this out a little bit more on page 30. Bottom of the first paragraph, he says, so historical education wills it are these still human beings when then ask oneself, we're only machines that think, write, and talk. Like, are we even really humans anymore in a certain sense, or are we merely machines that are sort of simulating, thinking and talking and writing? And we're not trying to make some sort of philosophy of mind sort of argument here, but rather something about what passes for thinking and how we're taught to think is more computational. It's much more based upon certain systems of processing, something like that, than it is perhaps real reflections or expressions of an activity that affirmed life. If you drop down to the bottom portion of the next paragraph, he says, it's italicized, only strong personalities can endure history. The weak are completely extinguished by it. It keeps us from trusting ourselves, as a passage a little bit below that says. History wipes out the individual. It makes one not in touch with their individuality. Later in the text talks about egoism, being our God. The idea, taking the idea of the self seriously as something that is the self that needs to act, that needs to do, that isn't going to sort of just become obliterated by conformity with, in whether it's a cynical conformity, an ironic conformity, a mindless conformity. We need to think about history and do history in a way that doesn't obliterate individuality, as it were. Okay. Education, on page 31, he talks about how we're hollowed out by education. The way that we approach education isn't helping us towards these liberatory aims that he's talking about. Section 6, he's going to get into this idea of objectivity a bit more, and he's going to talk about it specifically as it relates to justice. We're getting at prejudice or bias and objectivity, and Nietzsche is all about he's all about bias. And we have the negative associations with that term, in most contexts. And Nietzsche is trying to say, like objectivity is an illusion, and the idea that like justice or a theory of justice, a just judgment can occur from an objective place. It's just an illusion. It's not real. Let's see. He says, there's some really. We're going to be skipping lots of good passages just so we can get through it. But if you look at on page 34, he says, and might not an illusion, again, the bottom of page 34, lurk even in the highest interpretation of the word objectivity. By this word, one understands a condition in the historian in which his view of an event with all its motives and consequences is so pure that it has no effect at all on its subjectivity. One has in mind that aesthetic phenomenon, that detachment from all personal interest with which the painter sees his inner picture in a stormy landscape. Amid lightning and thunder on a rough sea, one has in mind the total absorption in things, yet it is a superstition to believe that the picture which things produce in a man is such a state of mind, in such a state of mind, reproduces the empirical essence of those things. Or is one to think that things in such moments, as it were, retrace, counterfeit, reproduce themselves photographically on a pure passivity through their own activity. So I'm going to read a little bit more here, but I just want to say that Nietzsche takes art in the full variety of ways. The poetic, the playwright, the painter, the musician, right? takes all those very seriously. He thinks a lot about that process, and it comes out a lot in terms of philosophy's relationship to creativity in the arts. And on one hand, the individual, through this sort of Dionysian process, like a almost ecstatic process, sort of loses themselves in the creative process, and they're sort of they merge and become one with the process and with whatever it is that they're creating. And so, in a sense, it sort of takes the ego out of it in a certain regard. Nevertheless, it's not objective. It's still very much a bias of the process, and it's sort of a way of saying that, like a deep subjectivity, as it were, it is something that reflects the truth of a phenomenon, the truth of an event, with much more fidelity than like some idea of sort of taking a step back from the process and viewing it, with some degree of like analytic clarity. That this is what we're looking at, a work of art. And Nietzsche is saying that history is a work of art, or at least it should be, right? That it's some sort of blend of rigorous sort of scientific method and art, like drama. That ultimately its truth derives more from perhaps its aesthetic properties, as the sort of as the artist, the historian as artist, immersing themselves and sort of losing themselves in the process of the writing of history. Something like that. And let me also mention that, oftentimes throughout Nietzsche's work, it's helpful to keep in mind that, especially with the early work, and I think it might linger in the later work. It's just perhaps evolved. Perhaps there's a more complicated, nuanced lexicon or conceptual way of presenting it. Is you always have the sort of dueling forces in Nietzsche's thought. In the early work, it's Apollo and Dionysus representing two cultural forces, or two sort of instinctual impulses, as it were, and that in here it's sort of represented as something like the superhistorical and the unhistorical, and I'm not trying to say that they fall exactly into the same sort of pattern, and these aren't like reductive binaries. It's much more like very complex tensions that you find when you think about culture, when you think about history, when you think about certain phenomena, when you think about the human psyche. And so with history, it's the idea of the drive towards the creation of truth as something that's sort of it's universal. It's the big picture of things, and then with the sort of unhistorical, it's the trying to, the selective, the artistic forgetting of, aspects of history, historical events, shrugging off the weight of history. And I think that for Nietzsche, while, early on in this text, you certainly get the sense that it's the unhistorical that he's wanting to champion, which I think in a way is sort of like the Dionysian, in that it's not that Nietzsche ever says, it's got to be all Dionysus all the time. He understands the need for order. He understands the need for, a narrative. He understands that kind of stuff. Nomos physis, another one of those sort of tensions, what is it that comes, quote unquote, naturally, and what it is in terms of the ordering of things. That these two, I think, have their pros and cons, and that ultimately perhaps some level of harmony should be established. However, I think that if something like the Apollinian, in whatever form or whatever mode of it we're talking about, if it's been around for too long, enjoying too much, influence, excessive scientism or excessive history, then you need the corrective sort of, now you need to start the unhistorical, now you need to start the artistic. You need the sort of counterfoil, right? Okay, next paragraph here on page 35, he says, that would be a mythology and a bad one to boot. Besides, one forgets that moment is just the most powerful and spontaneous moment of creation and the inner beings of the artist, a moment of composition of the highest possible kind, whose result may well be an artistically true portrait, but not a historically true one. To think history objectively in this manner is the silent work of the dramatist, that is, to think everything in conjunction, to weave a whole out of the isolated, everywhere with the presumption, that a unity of plan must be put into things. If it is not there, so man spins his web over the past and subdues it. So his impulse to art expresses itself, but not his impulse to truth and justice. Objectivity and justice have nothing to do with each other. I don't have a whole lot more to add here, rather that I think we're getting at artistically true and historically true, and in the sense that we usually receive it, and what Nietzsche is sort of, I think, trying to draw out is that the historically true has been associated with the sort of scientifically true, scientific method as it applies to the past, and not the artistic truth that you would say, like that a Shakespeare or a dramatist, a poet, or whatever else, whoever else might present it. And what I think that he's getting at is that there's a problematic relationship there, and one in which history, I think that it should become more of an art in this regard, that it's able to sort of speak to, paint the portrait of historic truth in a way that historic truth, as it's usually considered, isn't able to do. Okay. On page 36, bottom of that top paragraph, he says, if the value of a drama lies merely in its final and main thought, then the drama itself would be a very long, crooked, and laborious way to its goal. And so I hope that history may not see its significance in general thoughts as a kind of bloom and fruit, rather that its value is just this: to describe with insight a known, perhaps common theme, an everyday melody, to elevate it, raise to a comprehensive symbol, and so let a whole world of depth and meaning, power and beauty be guessed in it. I mean, he's kind of getting at the reason to do history. Why do history? It's not to sort of continue to add, fact after fact after fact. It's the idea of elevation, and using these terms like melody, to elevate it, raise to a comprehensive symbol, the whole world depth and meaning, power and beauty to be guessed. And I mean, this is like life affirming language. This is it's not to create databases of just somehow through artifactual research to get these quantifiables. Again, aspects of that, degrees of that, great, but it needs to be approached and orchestrated in such a way as that it's drawing us out and up into greater aspirations, challenges, right? Because he thought about those different ways of doing history, all sort of being appropriate to particular times and places. And so, history, whatever in whatever mode that it's happening, that monumental, antiquarian, critical, it needs to be having this motive. It needs to have this sort of aspiration to, draw humanity into this sort of healthy relationship, with ourselves, with our society, so that we can act, so that we're not cynical, so that we're not passive. Okay. Let's see. Okay, let me... Section 7. Section 7, looking at page 39, Nietzsche writes about, what happens to the creative instinct. He says at the top of page 39, a religion, for example, which under the rule of pure justice is to be transformed into historical knowledge, a religion which is to be thoroughly known in a scientific way, will at the end of this path also be annihilated. Drop down a couple lines. He says, only with love, however, only surrounded by the shadow of the illusion of love, can man create, that is, only with an unconditional faith in something perfect and righteous. Each man who is forced no longer to love unconditionally has had the root of his strength cut off. He must wither, that is, become dishonest. In such effects, art is opposed to history. And only if history can bear being transformed into a work of art, and this is kind of getting at what we were talking about before, that is, to become a pure art form, may it perhaps preserve instincts or even arouse them. Yeah, I guess that's building towards what I've been trying to point out. That Nietzsche's getting at it here. History needs to become art that preserves human instincts and it moves us. And the degree to which history or other endeavors, other human activities, social activities, institutional activities, institutional practices, that perhaps this is something that they need to do as well, especially in as much as they have some bearing on what it is that we consider to be true, on what, to the degree to which they embody or stake some sort of claim in the practice of justice within society. That some degree of art is necessary here. Okay. Let's go to page 42. He says, if you drop down about a third of the way down the page, he says, believe me, if men are to labor and become useful in the scientific factory before they are ripe, science will soon be ruined as well as the slaves put to use all too soon in history. He says, I regret that one is already required to use the linguistic jargon of slaveholders and employers in order to describe such conditions, which ought to be thought basically free of utilities, exempted from the struggle of survival. But the words factory, labor market, off-utilization, and all the rest of the auxiliary verbs of egoism involuntary throng to one's lips. If one wants to describe the English generation of scholars, sterling mediocrity becomes even more mediocre and science ever more useful in the economic sense. And he goes on to talk about, if you look at near the bottom of the page, it says, division of labor, fall in line, are for once to be told clearly and bluntly, if you want to further science as quickly as possible, you will destroy it as quickly as possible, as the hen will perish if artificially forced to lay eggs too quickly. I mean, he's getting at the mechanization of human beings, of understanding these various processes in these very inhuman terms. That it's just like do science, develop technology, train workers, right? That all of this is getting away from, I think, a type of healthy individualism, and it's bad for the individual. It's bad for the science. It's perhaps bad for the technologies that we develop. That this unhealthy relationship to history in terms of understanding what history is, how it happens, and what role it plays in our life is one that's not good for ourselves and for our institutions. And I think that he's getting at here, and it's also playing into the problems that he would have with, like, with Marxism. It's problematic for the other end of the spectrum as well. And if you're familiar with some of Nietzsche's other early writings, then of course Nietzsche feels as though slavery is just part of a culture, and not the institution of slavery as we're familiar with it, in as much like it's not so much that, right, but the idea that there's going to be people who comprise the majority or the mass of workers in a society that are sort of filling a sort of a utility. They're doing the stuff that makes the society works, and it's not as though they have a lot of choice in the matter. So, is there? I don't want to get off track too much, but can one have a theory of a working class in which the relationship to history that they have is useful to them as well? Nietzsche is always much more concerned with the aristocratic values of the few who are able to undertake great tasks. But in another sense, like, is there an understanding of culture, an understanding of society that's not good for the workers either, to such a sense that it ends up impacting the more sort of elite figures in society that are able to ultimately justify the cultural practices, cultural biases, to justify that society. We would look to the art that they create. We would look to the things that a society generates as a sort of like idea of justification for whatever it was going on in that society. And so I think deplorable institutions, whether that's the slavery of the past or the slavery of the present, and whatever we call it, whatever we say it is, if it's basically a manner of living that isn't healthy, does what our society generates. Like, if we make everybody work a lot for the most of their life, and for the most part things that people don't enjoy doing, do we create anything in our society that justifies subordinating the vast majority of people in society to that way of life, right? It's to me, it seems hard to say that we do. Whatever passes for art, it seems a dubious claim. And of course, and this is getting into different theorists, different philosophers, but what if society is able to convince the majority of people that what they're doing is in their best interest? Then it becomes even more complicated, with no small amount of bearing on the relationship that one has to history. Like, if you think that your life is better off, you're living a more just life, a more economically rewarding life, a more psychologically sane life than anyone who's ever existed before, then yeah, like, we're probably just going to keep on, getting up every morning, going to the job, doing the thing. And it's not that the job is a problem. It's not necessarily anyways. It's rather, are these things allowing for active, liberated, responsible living, right? And not sure that it is. Okay. Let's see. Okay, let me. There's certainly more I want to comment on, but let's go to page. So we're section 9, and go to page 53. And he says in the second half of that second paragraph on page 53, he says, but the world must go forward. That ideal condition cannot be achieved by dreaming. We must fight and struggle to achieve it. And only through cheerfulness is there a way to redemption, the redemption from this misleading, owlish seriousness. There will come a time when one will wisely refrain from all constructions of the world process or of the history of mankind, a time when one no longer considers the masses at all, but once again individuals who consider a kind of bridge across the wild stream of becoming. These do not, as it were, continue a process, but live in timeless simultaneity, thanks to history, which permits such cooperation. They live as the republic of geniuses, of which Schopenhauer speaks somewhere. One giant calls to the other across the bleak intervals of ages, and undisturbed by the wantonly noisy dwarfs who creep away beneath them, the lofty conversation of spirit continues. The task of history is to be the mediator between them, and so again and again to provide the occasion for and lend strength to the production of greatness. No, the goal of humanity cannot lie at the end, but only in its highest specimens. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of Ubermensch here, a lot of the idea of, you know, what's great in us is that we're a bridge and not a goal. There's not, and this is getting into those biases that we are these potential problems for the surfeit or excess of history, and the excess of knowledge and all that other stuff that we talked about at the beginning of section 5. That one of the things that it does is it talks about, you know, it's teleologically oriented in that there's an end. There's like what we're aiming for. There's like an ideal, like future, you know, political, social, whatever. And what Nietzsche is saying is like, when we realize that the aspirations for life affirmation and greatness lie within individuals, whenever, wherever they are, that, you know, the real task is within those who are leaving behind the past, right, but haven't attained to the future because they live right now, and that they're undertaking the dangerous vocation of making history, living history, of not preserving values so much as creating values, which means challenging values. You know, there's a perhaps an approach to living that's able to draw on what's come selectively and bring that to bear right now towards building a bridge to the future. And then it's not just like something that like happened. It's not just you just sort of throw up your hands and let history happen, and then you just sort of solve historical problems, or you just sort of like their math equations, like, oh, well, this, you know, here's what's happening in our society with, you know, A, B, and C, and if we just go back and we look at history and we sort of, you know, do a little research, like we can just take the history and plug in, like, you know, the right sort of you know, corresponding events, and you know, now we have a formula. Now we have a sort of way of solving the, you know, social ills. I mean, I don't think that's what Nietzsche's getting at. That it's not it's not a science problem in that regard. I mean, history is lived. History is art. It talks about our disposition to our own life, and the degree to which we learn from history. You know, it's a sort of existential learning more so than it is anything else. Yeah. Okay. And notice all the emphasis here on cheerfulness, like, you know, joy. These are positive sort of, like, you know, affects. These are we're not to come cynically to this task. We're not to come ironically to this task. We're to undertake this with joy and with cheerfulness, right? Love, even. Let's let's just get to section 10. On page 58, second paragraph, he says, "Dangerous and exciting was this voyage. How far we are now from the quiet contemplation with which we first saw our ship float out to sea. In tracking down the dangers of history, we have found ourselves most severely exposed to them. We ourselves display the traces of those sufferings which, as a consequence of an excess of history, came over men of recent times, and precisely this treatise, as I will not conceal, shows its modern character, the character of weak personality. In the excess of criticism and the immaturity of its humanity, and the frequent transition from irony to cynicism, from pride to skepticism, and yet I trust in the inspiring power which, instead of a genius, guides my vehicle. I trust in youth to have guided me correctly when now it forces me to protest against the historical education of modern youth. And when in protest I demand that above all men must learn to live and use history only in the service of life they have learned to live." So remember, at the time in which Nietzsche is living, there's been this sort of, review of history sort of in recent years, historically speaking, of coming to sort of develop, aspects of his own discipline, right, as a classical philologist, of historiography, like this sort of the rigor of it, like, how does one do history? What's happening? Can we create a universal, narrative, an accurate portrait of what's happened before? The approach to how to do that, and what the aims and aspirations of it are, what the limits of it are. But all of this sort of has a negative impact on doing history, and then also on the history that we receive as a result. And so Nietzsche's coming back and he's emphasizing restoring life-affirming properties to this, human undertaking, this human art of it, so that we don't become hollowed out, that we don't become cynical, we don't become sort of passive to what's going on in the world. There's a reason that we've accumulated so much knowledge about all areas of life, well, just sticking with history, and why people are today probably historically less informed than they've ever been before. Like, this is one of the negative side effects to this disadvantageous understanding of history in relationship to history. There's a bit more here that I wouldn't mind getting at, but I'll just end with this, and this is on the last page of this Hackett edition. On page 64, in the middle of the page, he says, "The Greeks learned gradually to organize chaos by reflecting on themselves in accordance with the Delphic teaching, which is, of course, know thyself." He says that is by reflecting on their genuine needs and letting their sham needs die out. Nietzsche is sort of wrapping up this work by saying, he understands that there's a chaos within. And this chaos within needs to be addressed. And there's without falling prey to a rigid, fixed interiority, exteriority sort of picture of things. But that part of doing history is the organizing of chaos, just like the Greeks did. The Greeks added order to their lives through the various institutions that they cultivated. And that part of doing this clarifies what it is that we really need and what it is that we don't. And this is sort of getting into like what Herbert Marcuse will talk about, if you're familiar with that philosopher. True needs and false needs, right? We want to overcome false needs, and we want to discover what our true needs are. And this is one of the benefits of a life-affirming approach to doing history, is that we find out what it is that we really need and what it is that we don't. And with that, I'll end just by saying this is preparatory work. This is towards building the future by living, right now, authentically and courageously. Confronting what it is that is perhaps most challenging about the human experience. For better, I mean, the good stuff and the bad stuff, and even calling into question what's the good stuff and the bad stuff. And I know that can take a lot more unpacking, but that's one of the things that Nietzsche does well is, confront us, provoke us to consider the messier stuff about being a human. Man, there's so much more we could say. But in any case, I've talked long enough. I hope this was of use to you. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking.